The first concern of the narrators in their tales was the restoration of identity. Yesterday, I dealt with the upheavals that led to the mass expatriation of millions of Africans. We cannot know the numbers. The range, researchers, people have done research on this. Researchers have brought in figures between 10 million and 20 million. But we don't know. And because Toni Morrison, the novelist, dedicates her beloved to the 60 million and more. In other words, your guess is as good as mine. We cannot know, but the numbers are staggering. And the continent was really the new dead of its flower, the best human resources. I believe that the continent has not recovered since that the expatriation of some of its best and most vital human resources. But today I'm going to talk about the psychology of recovery. When the Africans came into the United States at that time, the New World, and the West Indies, they were quite disoriented and very unhappy. But gradually they stabilized and began to tell their stories. Today, I want to talk about one aspect of that recovery, which is their retrieval of their identity, the identity that was submerged, that was lost. They had, as part of their recovery process, to restore this identity in their narratives, to tell us who they actually were, to rescue themselves from absolute anonymity. The first concern of the narrators in their tales was the restoration of identity. Slavery destroyed the identity of the African. The ambush or chase of the unsuspecting individual was an experience full of terror. But by far the most disabling psychological blow fell upon him when he was captured and dragged from home and community to the wide, impersonal world of strangers, where he lost his identity and became anonymous. Loss of identity began with loss of the original first name and surname. Those were names that most intimately reflected the African background. In place of these, the African was tagged with names picked up from here and there by his master. These names were often carelessly or even capriciously selected. Thus, Equiano earned the name Gustavus Vassa in a most casual circumstance from his English master. He writes in his life, "While I was on board this ship, my captain and master named me Gustavus Vassa. I, at that time, began to understand him a little and refused to be called so, and told him as well as I could that I would be called Jacob. But he said I should not, and still called me Gustavus. And when I refused to answer to my new name, which I at first did, it gained me many a cough. So at length I submitted, and by which I have been known ever since, by which name I have been known ever since." Now, Equiano subsequently became a dedicated fighter for the African cause and the abolition of the slave trade, which would in some way seem to justify an association with Sweden's patriot king. But it remains a moot point whether the British naval captain of the Industrious Bee, who gave Equiano the name Gustavus Vasa, was aware of its possible implications. Earlier on, Equiano records that he had already been differently named by different owners. In this place I was called Jacob, but on board the African Snow I was called Michael. Every one of the narrators carried a new name as a badge of servitude, whether it was conferred in a mood of playful irresponsibility or as a mark of special favor. Venture, that's Venture Smith, was so named by a steward on a vessel, quote, on account of having purchased me with his own private venture. Phyllis Whitley was given the favor of her master's surname. Ajayi Ayemi became Samuel Crowther after a British benefactor who had richly endowed the Church Missionary Society. The Ghanaian Otoba Kogwano was named James Stewart. Ayuba Suleiman became Job Solomon, his original names mercifully converted to their Hebraic equivalents. Abubakar al-Siddiq was called Edward Donlan. Ali Esami became William Harding in Sierra Leone, and the Ghanaian Ignatius Sancho was so named after Don Quixote's rustic squire by the three maiden sisters to whom he was offered as a gift. Where an original name managed to survive, it was anglicized or Gallicized out of recognition. Thus, Omar ibn Said became known severally as Mero, Umero, Maro, and finally Moho. Even within Africa, Dorugu Adamu, whose enslavement began and ended on the continent, was not spared the embarrassment of having his original name changed. He says as follows, I was given a new name. When they asked me my name, I told them it was Dorugu. Nevertheless, they called me by a Kanuri name, Barkagana. In fact, Dorugu is a Hausa, not a Kanuri. But the Kanuri who enslaved him decided to change his name from a Hausa name to a Kanuri name. For the narrators, restoration of identity begins with the re-establishment of the original name, the name with which an individual's society in Africa first gave him his sense of identity, his human personality. Nor was this a mere sentimental gesture or posturing. In Africa, the personal name has an ontological significance. It always has a meaning, which is in turn metaphysically assimilated to the person who bears it and the destiny which surrounds the person. To lose the personal name is therefore to lose the integrity and autonomy of the individual personality. And conversely, to restore the original personal name is to restore the individual's sense of wholeness as a human being. The narrators, therefore, give deserved significance to the name factor. Equiano writes in his life concerning his name, I was named Olauda, which in our language signifies vicissitude or fortune also, one favored and having a loud voice and well spoken. Abubakar al-Siddiq begins his autobiography, written in Arabic and subsequently translated into English, with, "My name is Abu Bakr al-Siddiq. My birthplace is Timbuktu." And in a letter to another Muslim from West Africa living in Kingston, Jamaica, he refers to him by the name of Muhammad Ukaba. Abu Bakr wrote in his letter, "I now answer your last letter. My name is in Arabic Abon Bekr Sadiq, and in Christian language Edward Donlan. I was born in Timbuktu and brought up in Jenne." Ayuba Suleiman does not only introduce himself in his personal and family names, but he also includes his clan name, as in the practice among the Fulbe people. The English recorder reports as follows: Job's countrymen, like the Eastern people and some others, used to design themselves by the names of their ancestors, and in their appellations mention their progenitors several degrees backward, though they also have surnames for distinguishing their particular families, much after the same manner as in England. Job's name in his own country is Hayuba bun Sulemana bun Hibramena, that is Job, the son of Solomon, the son of Abraham. The surname of his family is Jalo. Ayuba signs his name in Arabic as Ayub ibn Suleiman Jal, which, when given full orthographic rendering in his Pula language, reads Ayuba Suleiman Diallo. Distributable into his personal name, Ayuba, his surname Suleiman, and the name of his Fulbe clan, Diallo. Omar Said opens his biographical fragment written in Arabic with, "My name is Omar ibn Said. My birthplace was Futa Turo, between two rivers." So crucial is the name factor in the re-establishment of the authenticity of experience that Alex Haley, the African-American author of Roots, centers the epical movements of his narrative on Kunta Kinte, the eponymous African ancestor. The success of the work depends to some extent upon the author's relentless researches linking origin, history, and destiny to the African source and the mystique of the character's Africanity. This mystique has reasonably been linked to and concretized by the mystique of an original name. The restoration of identity in the narrative admits more than the re-establishment of personal name. Just as slavery involved the rupture of an individual's integration within family and community, in like manner, restoration of identity takes in the re-establishment of the integrated view of the individual within the context of family and community. Often, the community is itself transcended to accommodate wider geographical contexts and social environments. Nor should this be a matter of surprise. The process of dehumanizing the African began with his reduction to a state of anonymity, which was in turn hastened by the fostering, consciously and unconsciously, of a view of the individual outside the authenticating matrix of family, community, and environment. It is in the nature of human beings that the brutalization of their fellows often begin with a denial to the victims of those facilities which make them identifiable with the rest of humanity. The slave was stripped of paternity, maternity, fraternity, sorority, kinship ties, and social virtues, which would have made him identical to everyone else. The attempt by the narrators to restore their human identity, therefore, inevitably took in details of family connections. Paternity and maternity are important factors, so are family status and economic standing. Every narrator gives consideration to these things. Thus, in his life, Equiano dwells in endearing detail upon his family, his father's 7 children, including an only sister with whom he was kidnapped, his being his mother's favorite son, his father's high status as a titled elder and owner of several domestic slaves. His father's social status receives marked emphasis of its significance in enhancing Equiano's identity and the authenticity of his narrative. Quote, "My father was one of those elders or chiefs I have spoken of, and was styled Ngwirichi," he writes, a term, as I remember, importing the highest distinction and signifying in our language a mark of grandeur. He follows up with other authenticating details that explain the functions, rituals, and protocols of title, as well as the facial marks that distinguish men of status and achievement in Igbo land, adding, quote, "Most of the judges and senators were thus marked. My father had long borne it. I had seen it conferred on one of my brothers, and I also was destined to receive it by my parents." The situation described by Equiano obtained in Igbo land up until living memory. Entitled elders with face scarifications are still alive in some parts of the region. Actually, I saw one of them, one of the elders with the face scars. He was really old, must have been in his 90s at that time. A tall, towering man who walked with a pole just to support his weight. Crowther also describes his family background as an authenticating necessity of his tale. Quote, "I am the son of a weaver. My father gradually introduced me into the trade of weaving the country cloth, as well as all his relations were of that trade. He also occasionally attended to agriculture." Ayuba Suleiman's family and social background are given impressive build-up in his narrative, which is distilled into the very impressive title of the pamphlet in which Suleiman's narrative first appeared. The special status of his father is heavily underlined. Quote, "Job, who is now about 31 or 32 years of age, was born at a town called Bunda in the country of Galumbo, that is Katumbo actually, in the kingdom of Futabundu in Africa, which lies on both sides of the Senegal River, and on the south side reaches as far as the River Gambia. About 50 years ago, Ibrahim, the grandfather of Job, founded the town of Bunda in the reign of Bubakar, then king of Futa, and was by his permission sole lord, proprietor, and governor of this town, and at the same time high priest or alpha, so that he had a power to make what laws and regulations he thought proper for the increase and good governance of his new city. Historians would not credit Suleiman with all the importance and status claimed, but that he was of the scholarly priestly connection is well considered. which still puts him within the significant social and political class of the 18th century in the Western Sudan. In the autobiography of Abu Bakr al-Siddiq, the family is heavily authenticated and the genealogical information is plastered thick. Quote, "My father's name was Kara Musa the Sharif of a noble tribe. Watarawi Tafsir. His brothers were named Idris, Abdal Rahman, Mahmud, and Abu Bakr. Their father, my grandfather, was Emir al-Qaid Umar ibn Shaid al-Malik. He lived in the cities of Timbuktu and Jenne. He was also called Ibn Abu Ibrahim because Ibrahim, may his grave be visited, was of this country. My mother's name was Nagodi, that is in the Hausa tongue, but her real name was Hafsa. Her brothers, she had many of them, were named Abdullah Tafsir as-Siva, the purified, Yaqub Yahya, Hamid Baba, Mumin, Uthman, and Abdal Karim. Her sisters were Habiba, Fatima, Maryam, and Maimuna. Their father was named Al-Hajj Muhammad Tafsir of the cities of Katsina and Borno. The picture admits an ever-increasing number of relatives on both sides of the family tree. The memory bank is drawn upon heavily because of the significance of family in giving identity and authenticity to narrator and narrative. Other narrators are just as concerned to put their identity in the wider, validating context of family and community. Ali Aisemi's narrative opens with, in the town of Magriari Tapsoa, there was a man named Mamade Achi, son of Kodo, and he was my father. It then proceeds to give the details of his family history and the birth of the children in order and sexes. The ethnographic study of 18th century Ijebuland contains details of the informant's family network, rendered very complex by the practice of polygamy. Osifu Konde, the narrator, is said also to have followed his father's career as a merchant. Joseph Wright states in his memoir, quote, "I was born of respectable parents, but they were not very rich. My father was a member of council, and he had 2 wives, besides those of his father. My mother was the first wife my father had, and she bore us 5 children unto my father. We were all boys except 1 girl." These details of personal history and family connections are meant to restore human identity to those whose personal lives form the material of the narratives, to restore to them the status of real people as children of identified and identifiable parents, with brothers and sisters who are also recognizable people. They show themselves as members of families which, in more auspicious times and places, have had full and dignified existence. But retrieval of identity does not begin and end with personal names and family connections. Almost as significant is the identity of the environment, of the land of birth and the city, and the spiritual and cultural heritage of the motherland. Pictures of the homeland are drawn, often in miniature and occasionally in a comprehensive manner. The journeys of the captives in Africa itself provide the opportunity for geographical and environmental description. From individual accounts which reinforce the authenticity of the narratives, a mass of circumstantial details is built up which throws light on the condition of life in those troubled times. Some incidents surrounding the experiences of some narrators, especially those who were victims of war, fit into the larger historical movement of their times. History, geography, and culture of West Africa find representation in the narratives, not in their own right as autonomous expressions, but as necessary scaffolding to the realization of the aims of the narrators to re-establish their submerged identity. The most extensive drawn image of the African homeland of the 18th century is that contained in Ekwenor's life. Ekwenor begins from his tiny little village of Iseke and works outward through the largest known contiguous political framework until he takes in the entire continent. Iseke, which is a small town in Ihiala division of Anambra State, actually it's now in Imo State because Anambra State, that place had been actually divided. There had been more states in Nigeria as the country evolved. So it used to be in one state, now it's in the other state. Iseke, which is a small town in Ihiala division, east of Nigeria, is set into the context of the Benin Empire, which was widely known to European travelers up to the 18th century. And the empire, in turn, is put into the context of the whole continent, with a fair measure of speculative geography thrown in as well. This was Ekwenor's method of authenticating his material in the interest of the reader. But the intention is to touch chords which would readily enlist response. His home is, quote, situated in a charming, fruitful vale. The customs and institutions of his people are described with great accuracy and detail and are widely recognizable today, 200 years after his book. A remarkable feat of memory helped by an incredible sense of observation has created for the region a piece of ethnographic recording that is still difficult to surpass in beauty and insight. Using those institutions and cultural activities which heighten human interests, and those manners and customs which set people off sharply and emphasize their human worth, Ekwenor proceeded to give his readers a large and convincing image of an African society different from the quaint, stereotyped Africa of the European imagination. This image stresses social order through the functioning of the Council of Elders, who dispense justice to all with humaneness, only a little sharpened by the law of retaliation. Instances of the tempering of justice with humanity are given. The village arena democracy is described with a very high degree of accuracy and intelligent discrimination. The structures of power and responsibility and the diverse social roles and statuses are described, and Ekwenor's and his family is located. The culture is described with enthusiasm and justified pride, and always with honesty. On the significance of music and dance among his people, he writes, "We are almost a nation of dancers, musicians, and poets. Thus, every event, such as a triumphant return from battle or other cause of public rejoicing, is celebrated in public dances, which are accompanied with songs and music suited to the occasion. Manners of dress are described as follows. The dress of both sexes is nearly the same. It generally consists of a long piece of calico or muslin wrapped loosely round the body, somewhat in the form of a highland plaid. This is usually dyed blue, which is our favorite color. Besides this, our women of distinction wear golden ornaments, which they dispose with some profusion on their arms and legs. And on eating habits, he states, our manner of living is entirely plain, for as yet the natives are unacquainted with those refinements in cookery which debauch the taste. Bullocks, goats, and poultry supply the greatest part of their food. The flesh is usually stewed in a pan to make it savory. We sometimes use also pepper and other spices, and we have salt made of wood ashes. Our vegetables are mostly plantains, ears, yams, beans, and Indian corn. The architecture is functional and organized according to role, sex, and status. Among the members of a family, the economic institution is described with an eye for the same functional relevance. The picture is comprehensive, taking in the commercial activities, manufactures, and agriculture. Quote, as we live in a country where nature is prodigal of our favors, our wants are few and easily supplied. Of course, we have few manufactures. In such a state, money is of little use, however. However, we have some small pieces of coin, if I may call them that. We also have markets at which I have been frequently with my mother. Agriculture is our chief employment, and everyone, even the children and women, are engaged in it. Thus, we are all habituated to labor from our earliest years. Everyone contributes something to the common stock, and so we are unacquainted with idleness. We have no beggars. The religious beliefs are described with a touch of humor and candor, even though Equiano, by the time he was writing, had already become a Christian. Equiano's representation of homeland realities has been illustrated copiously here, with good reason. Apart from his book providing the most comprehensive view of a West African society in the 18th century, his handling of it is also the most competent. From the accounts of the others, the image of the home appears fragmentarily, but every one of them includes something of the geographical, cultural, and environmental conditions of his African background as a means to strengthening his identity and narrative authenticity. Ayuba Suleiman's Bondu is well set geographically and lies on both sides of the river Senegal and south towards the Gambian River. Its Islamic foundations are stressed, including the ordinance that no person who flies thither for protection shall be made a slave. Unfortunately, this beautiful provision was extended only, quote, to all in general that can read and know God. In other words, to Orthodox Muslims. Suleiman was actually on his way to sell 2 Negroes, in quote, for purchase of paper and other necessaries when he himself became a captive. Suleiman's African society is described in considerable detail in section 3 of his narrative. The agricultural division of labor, according to social status and sex, the caste system and social hierarchies, the exacting scholarly tradition, the sports and games, including elephant hunts, the customs of marriage, position, funeral ceremonies, and religious institutions. All are described with fidelity, but the text reveals the major weakness of the narrative midwifery of the amanuenses. Thomas Blewett, the recorder of this narrative, interjects subjective comments and supplies commentaries which, though they do not diminish narrative authenticity appreciably, yet certainly distract the attention of the reader. The constant referencing forward and backwards to European social institutions and cultural values supplied by the amanuenses to aid contemporary European readers to enter into what would be an unfamiliar and strange world. All this becomes unbearably tedious to a contemporary reader and destroys the spontaneity of narrative. Sally Bilali's Kiana is described with better feeling for narrative fluency, even though the piece is also transmitted through a medium. The narrative is allowed to run its course without too many interferences and interpositions from the recorder. The details of geographical location are even more fastidiously stated than in Ayuba Suleiman's narrative. Quote, Kiana is a considerable town within half a mile of a great river, near a mile wide, which is called Mayo, that's the river Niger, and which runs from the setting to the rising sun, and this to the north of the town. To the east of Kiana, this river unites with another large river, which flows into it from the south. On this southern river, the large town of Kuna and Jenne are situated. The two rivers unite beyond the latter town, that is, beyond Jenne. The details accumulate to cover the broad area of the upper and middle Niger, which since the 11th century had formed the center of flourishing African civilizations in the western Sudan. Kiana, which was probably a little town, very much like Equinos Iseke, is put into wider contexts by being related to such important commercial and educational centers as Kuna, Jenne, Segu, and Timbuktu. The area is considerable in size, more than 200 miles, we are told. The river Niger, with its tributaries, provides the main arterial highway linking these famous centers with one another and attracting external trade with the Arabs coming from the north, who descend in flotillas laden with salt, blankets, guns, pistols, beads, and cowries. The economic life is based on livestock and cultivation of rice and other cereals and vegetables. As in Ayuba Suleiman's Bondu, there is division of labor according to the sexes. The men, and I'm quoting here, the men work in the fields, fish, herd cattle, and weave. The women spin and attend to household duties, but never work in the field. Islamic tradition and practices are noted in the narrative also. House recesses are built to face the east. Children are taught to read and write Arabic by the priests or malams. Passages are repeated from the Quran. There are no slaves, and criminals are punished by fines. Everything to confer humanity and authenticity is included. Geographic location, the setting of the home, nature of the distribution of houses, economic activities, and religion. The narrative structure is skeletal, as in most of the texts, but enough outline of a humane and satisfying way of life is exposed. Abu Bakr al-Siddiq was born in Timbuktu and educated in Janneh and Buna, cities well known as centers of learning and commerce. Timbuktu and Janneh were well celebrated in the 17th century chronicles, the Tariq al-Sudan and Tariq al-Fatah. His travels, which were extensive, stretched from these centers eastwards to Katsina and Borno, and southwards to Buna and the fringes of the Ashanti Empire. These travels equipped him to describe the routes and geographical settings with competence. His description of life in Buna, a city he had made his town, was intimate, with reference to the community of learned men who had made it a flourishing base and the highly profitable gold mining enterprise which had grown there. Omar Said's place was Futatoro, between two rivers. Kogwano was born in the fancy town of Ajumako and had traveled to adjoining cities including Accra. Ali Esami was compelled to vacate his home and the war-torn capital to seek more peaceful pastures. The Yoruba cities where they were born were already in a turmoil when Crowther and Wright described them. Their narratives were therefore slanted in the direction of city defenses on walls, ditches, wooden fences, and gates, as well as the desperate strivings of those caught in the web of incomprehensible confusion. But these places are real, even though they were described in the process of disintegration. In general, the narratives provide an outline map of routes, cities, and market centers spread over a wide area of the West African region. As the African captives describe their unhappy odysseys from their homes to the coastal ports of Lagos, Badagry, Bonny, Anomabu, and Gohe, from which their journey out of the natal continent began, they provide a large body of information which indicates the widespread connections between different cities and peoples within the region. The truth that cannot be suppressed is that the geographical, environmental, and cultural features conveyed in the narratives are real. They confirm the reality and human identity of the narrators. These people did not fall from the sky, nor were they produced by that undifferentiated, vast, impenetrable jungle of the Western mind, fed upon fancy, ignorance, and mischief, such as had been well and fittingly ridiculed by Jonathan Swift when he wrote, and I quote, "Geographers in African maps with savage pictures fill their gaps, and o'er inhabitable downs place elephants for want of towns." In the narratives of the expatriate Africans of the 18th and 19th centuries, there are towns inhabited by people, there are families and clans and districts and principalities and states and empires. Africa is a human habitation. Education is an important matter for establishing identity. Every narrator leaves some evidence or another of his or her education. In their predominantly autobiographical records, the narrators never fail to give some indication of the processes of their early development, which invariably includes some form of account of their education. In his life, Equiano describes his early education within the traditional milieu as a means to strengthening the authenticity of his tale, especially that section of it which deals with cultural life in West Africa. First, he mentions his early cultural training in Igbo land prior to his journey into slavery. And quote, "The manners and customs of my country," he writes, "had been implanted in me with great care and made an impression on my mind, which time could not ease, and which all the adversity and variety of fortune I have since experienced served only to rivet and record." This probably explains the mass of ethnographic data accumulated in this autobiography and why it is the fullest record of life in Igbo land in the 18th century. In addition to this traditional base, Equiano obtained literate education through good offices and kindness of different people on board ship and on land. The list is quite impressive. David, his young American companion in different naval expeditions, wife of the shipmate at Guernsey, the captain's clerk in the Etna, and the Daniel Quinn, quote, about 40 years of age, a man very well educated. All these at different times helped to edge forward his enthusiasm for literacy, and he, an avid student with insatiable curiosity and unquenchable thirst for knowledge, soaked up new ideas and impressions from the most miscellaneous sources, as well as from institutions and academies. He leaves scattered all over the pages of his life evidence of his love of learning as well as of his immense receptivity to educational opportunities. I'll have to skip Equiano to go to Koguano. Koguano's credentials also include his formal literate education. And he writes in his book, "After coming to England and seeing others write and read, I had a strong desire and getting what assistance I could, I applied myself to learn reading and writing, which soon became my recreation, pleasure, and delight. And when my master perceived that I could write some, he sent me to a proper school for that purpose to learn. Since I have endeavored to improve my mind in reading and have sought to get all the intelligence I could in my situation in life towards the state of my brethren and countrymen in complexion and of the miserable situation of those who are barbarously sold into captivity and unlawfully held in slavery." Here, of course, it's talking about education as a tool for fighting for the rehabilitation of slaves. The master referred to his Causeway, official portrait painter to the Prince of Wales, whom Koguano served on being brought from Grenada to England at the age of 12. Phyllis Wheatley, her precocity has been generally noted. She herself did not devote her poetry to describing her early education. Rather, she relegates the subject prosaically to her correspondence addressed to Obiechina, a fellow West African young woman living in slavery in Newport. In her letters, she paid high tribute to her mistress, Mrs. Wheatley, and her daughter, Mary, who have who gave her a good educational start and drew her into New England Christian enthusiasms. Description of her educational progress also has tended to come from other people, including her master, John Whitley of Boston, and so on. A New England historian, Dr. Nathaniel Shortleff, adds more flesh to John Whitley's information, as well as improving on the former's grammatical presentation in a notice concerning Phyllis Whitley's education, published in the Boston Daily Advertiser. These are just the goodwill, people of goodwill, indicating the process of educating these West Africans, these slaves. Education within the Western tradition and through the Western script is also a credential established by African slaves like Crowther and Wright, who were exported to Sierra Leone. When they got to Sierra Leone, the missionaries also set up schools and educated them. And one of them, Crowther, actually became a bishop, ultimately. And some of them actually went to England and got more education. But I want to go on to the Muslims, who were quite well educated in West Africa before they got to the New World. The narrators from Senegambia, the Upper and Middle Niger and Borno, describe as part of their credentials their formal education within the Islamic tradition. And not only is there great anxiety to show that an individual has been well and truly educated, but this fact is further authenticated with reference to the learned scholar or scholars under whose guidance education was acquired. Islamic education has, in that respect, preserved the old world system of student-teacher, client-patron relationship, in which the quality of learning was closely linked to the reputation of the learned man who imparted it. Part of the authenticating process, therefore, has been each narrator's inclusion of information concerning the names and credentials of his instructors. The system was laborious, the system of Arabic education, often occupying several years and taking in at the higher reaches the study of logic, mathematics, rhetoric, and Quranic exegesis. The length of time was made inevitably long by the demands of two variants of Arabic available to the students, and which had to be mastered because they served different interests. Classical Arabic, in which the Quran and the earlier commentaries and tracts were composed, was one form, and modern Arabic, which was used more generally for writing non-Arabic languages like Mandinka, Jollof, Pearl, Hausa, and Kanuri. This was another form. So the students had to learn two forms of Arabic. In the autobiography of Omar ibn Said, the following information concerning his education is included in what is, after all, a brief fragment. I sought knowledge under the instruction of a sheikh called Muhammad Said, my own brother, and Sheikh Suleiman Kembe, and Sheikh Gabriel Abdel. I continued my studies 25 years and then returned to my home, where I remained 6 years. Ayuba Suleiman was probably exposed to as rigorous an education as Ibn Said, being of a priestly scholarly family and rising to the level of assistant imam or priest and scholar to his father when he was only 15 years old. His learning was impressive, for while in England and America, he had transcribed 3 copies of the Quran from memory and read and discussed both the New and Old Testaments of the Bible, which were written in his language. Ayuba Suleiman's view of education in his bundle was either distorted or misrepresented by his recorder, who wrote that the books in his country are all manuscripts, all upon religion, and are not more than 30 in number. Arabic script was not used for religious purposes only. This is a fact we know from research. Though many existing Arabic texts from that region apply to commentaries on the Quran and religious tracts for the times, a fair assemblage of manuscripts belong to the 18th century and earlier, and are devoted to chronicles and correspondences. They're used for letter writing. Nor were the existing documents only 30 in number, though the number known to an individual teacher or a group of scholars might be regarded as the definitive figure by them. But subsequent later researchers have found a lot more than 30 manuscripts. Salih Bilali describes education in Masina of his day much in the same terms that education in Islamic schools has survived to this day. Quote, all the children are taught to read and write Arabic by the priests or malams. They repeat from the Quran and write on a board which, when filled, is washed off. Abu Bakr gives testimony of his education and adventures, not in one center alone, but in a number of centers dotted over a considerable area of the Upper Niger, southwards to Buna. His picture is fairly comprehensive, and I like to quote it because it's an indication that many of the African slaves those days were actually scholars. I was educated in the town of Jenne and fully instructed in reading and construing the Quran, but in the interpretation of it with the help of commentaries. This was done in the city of Buna, where there are many learned men who are not natives of one place, but each of them, having quitted his own country, has come and settled there. The names of these Saids who dwell in the city of Buna were as follows: Abdullah ibn Hajj, Muhammad Watarawi, Muhammad al-Musafa, Fatih al-Bayad, Sheikh Abdul al-Shakari, from the land of Futa Jalon, Ibrahim Yusuf, from the land of Futa Toro, Ibrahim Abi Hassan, from Silla by descent, but born at Diara. These men used to meet together to hear the instructions of Abdullah ibn al-Hajj Muhammad Tafsir. Well, these are scholars in their own right, and they lived as a scholarly community, and they spent years and years discussing scholarly matters, philosophy, Islamic exegesis, and things like that. The information throws light on the intellectual history of the 18th and 19th centuries in this region, and is of immediate structural significance to the narrative because it gives a convincing picture of the narrator's impressive credentials as an educated man nurtured by dedicated scholars, the ulama, and exposed to the best ideas within the intellectual tradition of the day. The narrative of such a man is therefore worthy of acceptance as both genuine and authentic. The image of the narrator is set off by his intellectual connections. Ali Esami, who is a Kanuri, has a less education. He has less education. He tells us in his narrative, as to myself, I was put to school when I was 7 years old. When I had been reading at school till I was 9 years of age, they took me from school and put me into the school of circumcision. And after passing through the rites of circumcision, I returned to school, and having remained there 2 years longer, I left off reading the Quran. So he probably spent 5 years at the primary level. In other words, he had the barest primary education for Muslims, in addition to being inducted into the rites of circumcision promoted by traditional education and some sects of Islam. His was a more limited kind of training. Well, the eagerness of the narrators to include some information concerning their education can be attributed to a number of important reasons. In the first place, education enabled the oppressed and the deprived African to recover lost confidence, and to redeem himself or herself from ignoble silence. With the shock of captivity and expatriation, the heart of the enslaved African was numbed with grief, and his soul was filled with despondency. The human voice froze within him, unable to speak to a world suddenly turned malevolent. Gradually, after some decent interval, the initial shock began to wear off, and the sediments of evil began to settle, and clarity to appear. The submerged resources of the mind surged forward into the active consciousness. The sense of being human was again activated, and the precious realities of the African upbringing, especially those of the African infancy, began to come to the fore and to determine responses. Even slavery itself began to assume its proper place in the mind as an evil that must and should be surmounted with intelligence and strategy. The slave became a free man hemmed in with vicious constraints. His spirit was free, even though his body was chained. Those commentators who have unraveled the strategies adopted by the slaves to overcome the numerous impositions of the system, strategies that had their genesis in their African upbringing, have put their finger on the most specifically beneficial influence of African education. For it was that education obtained from the African base that made available to the suffering and uprooted Africans the means for responding to the disaster that had overtaken them and followed them to the land of their exile. The spirit of freedom which survived in the African, precarious as it may well have been, was built upon the memory of the past, the substantial past of close personal and social relationships, and of cultural achievements which had once been inseparable from the individual's sense of well-being. That past became more precious, more cogent, and more closely definitive of the sense of personal worth in the land of adversity. The urge to reenact that past, to narrate it, to share it with responsive and understanding audiences, or in defiance to shout it to the uncaring world, became irrepressible. The focus of that assertion of the past was its educational basis and validity, its revealing the modes through which an individual was initiated into the mystique of living and experience by absorbing the significant ideas, values, and attitudes of his or her society. It was by means of linking the isolated individual to the traditions and institutions of his or her people and making him or her into a social being. This awareness of being connected to the rich source of his or her African people's spiritual and cultural heritage revived the enslaved Africans in the land of bondage and gave them the confidence and sense of the cohesiveness of life and things necessary for dealing with the difficult realities of the present. Thus, those dispersed Africans who looked confused and disoriented in the eyes of their enslavers carried within them carried within them their humanity in the nature of African experience. What was left was the opportunity to expose this humanity to the inhabitants of their new environment in order to gain admission into the world of people. But the slave society was a harsh, artificial one, which refused to admit this humanity and resorted by coercion to prevent the Africans from expressing it or benefiting from the psychological strength which the past confers on the present. The inhuman laws that sought to degrade the African to the level of an animal were calculated to stop his or her voice, because the slave masters knew that if the African was allowed to speak, he or she would utter human sounds. The Africans thereafter, recognizing the virtue of being able to read and write, and of using writing to tell their stories, and through those stories unveil their humanity. That was why many of them ran panting after literate education. Literacy would, in their views, confer this power of unburdening the soul, of vindicating submerged identity, of unfreezing the voice and speaking to the world again. Neither the disapproving frowns of their oppressors nor the unreasonable laws of unjust governments would stop them. Fortunately, there were always some good people whose instincts and purity of heart made them the natural allies of humanity. Those people became the promoters of the cause of the embattled Africans and helped them, through literate education, to obtain the tools that prepared the ground for their legal and constitutional emancipation. To sum up, there is a paradox in all this. The paradox is that the enslaved Africans had to draw upon the past in order to reassert their human dignity in the present. It's a very paradoxical kind of situation. Thank you very much. Yep.
That, in fact, naming, although in some cultures were definitive, in other cultures were, in fact, very situational. And that is, at initiation, one may change one's name. At a new king in the area I studied, Obiechina, when a new king is installed, he takes a different name. And in that way, one senses that, in fact, names were, in fact, a flexible way of situating identity at certain points in one's life. And I wonder the extent to which, because we know on the slave ships, for instance, we know that, in fact, names were, in fact, given to fellow members of that terrible journey. So on the ship, the ships that went to, let's say, Brazil, members of the same, traveling on the same ship, were in fact called Malungu, which was, shipmate. We know in Jamaica, Shippy was the name, given to members who traveled on the same ship and may have been on the same plantation. So that I remember, I think it's Lewis, Monk Lewis, when he asked a young man, a young slave, why is he calling this older slave his uncle? Is he a relative, a blood relative? He says no. he and my grandfather or my father traveled on the same ship. So my sense is that, in fact, names and identity were much more flexible and may have, in fact, been very useful in the context. I'm still saying that the African background was useful, but it was not as definitive, I think, as you have presented it. I think in other cultures, perhaps in the culture of the Igbos, because you mentioned Equiano in that context, it could be that, in fact, the name was a definitive, reality. But in other areas, in fact, names were flexible enough at certain stages in one's life or one's status that, in fact, Africans from these areas may have found it very easy to, in fact, retrieve that very quickly, even on the ship, and on the plantation at a different time because of the sort of, things that I've described, the sort of background, that cultural baggage that they were brought. Could you address this, or did I misunderstand what you said?
No, you didn't. You didn't misunderstand me. It's, but I am trying to understand you. No, you're right. There's a certain flexibility in naming. If you can have more than one name. And if I give the impression that an individual is tagged with just one single definitive name, that would be a wrong impression because, I, for instance, everyone knows me as Emmanuel Obiechina. But I have heaps of names. My name is Nwafo. That's the name of the day on which I was born. There are 4 market days in Igbo. And everyone who is born on one of those days. And you're named for the deity who controls that day. I was born on Afo Day. And so I am Nwa Afo. Nwa is son of Afo. And that's my name as of right. The fact that I was born on that day. I am called Chiamuma. I am Wanonye. I am Oduche. I have about 5 or 6 names. And these are significant names. Names for an ancestor or a name that your mother gives to you, or your father or an uncle. They belong to you, all those names. But what I'm trying to understand is, do these people you talk about, who are very flexible with their names, do they forgo their original names? Because you can actually take a new name if you take a title.
Yeah.
If you take a title, of course, your status, your new status, would be underwritten, would be underlined by a new name.
For instance, you would see in the category Akande name,
Mm-hmm.
And then this would be listed next to the day name would be an ethnic group, and then you'll see Congo. So you know that the Congo man in the area of Angola would not be called, by that Akande name. Mm-hmm. So it could be that the slave masters, assigned an Akande name because it was easier to pronounce.
Well, the masters have this prerogative of naming. They will give you your name. And the thing is, they determine your identity, really. And as the sociologist Patterson, I think it is, talked about slavery and social death, that actually the master has that full right to make you what he wants you to be. And that includes giving you an identity that he specifically wants you to have. Because already you don't really exist as a viable person.
But those Akande names were in fact names that the Akan,
yes.
in the Coromantee, in the Caribbean,
yes.
in fact assigned themselves, kept, so it was not something assigned by the masters.
Okay.
But anyhow, I don't want to...
Well, no, you may well be right, yes. Yeah, please.
Will you comment on slavery in certain
today.
Compare the slavery to the past.
Actually, there is still slavery. The UNESCO, I mean, the researchers are still unearthing what's happening in Sudan. It's a little difficult for me to make out completely what's really happening there. Because there are rapes.
Are the Arabs enslaving the blacks? Is that?
That's the impression I get from the internet. The information I get is from the internet. That the Arabs mount raids in black communities and they capture people and they sell them. And in fact, there had been some kind of move by a group of people here in the United States who bought back those people. They purchased them back from those who bought them. They gave them money and said, give us back this person. And they set the person free. In other words, some surreptitious crime is going on somewhere in the Sudan. In other words, slavery is not ended. The United Nations says it's ended. I mean, legally it's ended. But in reality, it's still going on in all manner of ways. And it's probably the same principle. The Arabs, I'm talking here about transatlantic. I'm not talking about trans-Saharan slavery, which is quite a different thing, and big and older than the transatlantic slavery. Islam came to West Africa in the 11th century and brought with it this the selling of Africans across the desert to Arabia and those areas.
Does the slavery today differ much from the slavery before the transatlantic
I think so. What's
well, the slavery that existed in Africa before the
slavery
in America.
Oh yes, it did exist. It was much older than the transatlantic slavery. In fact, what transatlantic slavery did was to exacerbate the effect of slavery, and it was a different kind. The slave in Africa, and that's what some of the narrators trying to clarify, that Africans treated domestic slaves with humaneness. They ate the same food, they did the same work, they lived in the same types of houses, and they were treated with humanity. But whereas those of them who had gone to the New World saw a different kind of style of treating slaves.
What about the slavery in the Roman Empire and in ancient Greece?
Well, in Roman Empire they were treated just as roughly as they were treated in the New World. The slaves under the Romans were treated very roughly, and many a time they revolted.
In ancient Greece?
In ancient Greece, I suspect. Yeah, well, sociologists and other people know better. Yes?
Yeah, thank you again for another very, very insightful lecture, but I wanted to kind of push you on two issues here if I could. Especially at the end, you give us kind of a context for interpretation of the elements from the narratives that you like us to juxtapose or see in the two. And here's part of what I think I hear, and you tell me if I'm missing a piece. You identify the things people do and kind of literally what they've said. They stake a claim to a name. They'll talk about family attachments. They'll talk about status. They'll talk about physical geography and places they were from, make a claim to educational background. And you go through those pieces in a way of the scripts as people lay them out. What I didn't hear, and forgive me if I missed a piece of it, or if this was some of the text from yesterday, was something I read it that's in the title, that people are in the process of salvaging identity from a monumental wreckage, right? So that sense of, in many ways, emotionality, of hurt and injury, of triumph over suffering. I don't hear as much of that as I do the literal declaration of a name, a description of a place, a recounting of an educational experience. I didn't hear the anguish and that kind of sense of the great emotional energy that must be behind a real effort to reclaim oneself from social death, to borrow Orlando Patterson's phrase. So I wondered if you could speak to that more. I mean, the one example I thought I heard was at the very beginning, where you talk about having tried to reject the name Gustavo, and obviously paying a physical price for doing that and then just giving it up. But there didn't seem to be much emotional reflection around that.
Oh, this is my own fault.
But let me add the second question.
It has nothing to do with the narrators themselves. I am trying to interpret them. The narrators have done their work. They've told their story. They're full of pain and anguish when they talk about their captivity, how they were captured, the circumstances under which they lost their freedom, and so on. You could hear the pain in their voices. But it's my own intrusion as an interpreter of these people. How did they muster the confidence to tell the story? Because slavery itself has its psychological effect. It numbs the senses. It makes you feel like useless. But after a while, you collect your thoughts and you want to tell your story. You want the world to take note that I am not a cipher. I am not nothing. I am something. I am somebody. I am the son of some prominent chief. Or I have parents. I have brothers and sisters. I am human. Now, what I'm trying to do is to disentangle those things, the pain and anguish and all that, but then to go at a sub-level. What is it that prompts these people, that gingers them, that gives them the motivation, the strength to tell their story, it gives them the push? I think it is that groundedness in a past, the fact that that past holds a key to their humanity, and they use it to open the door, to open the present. It's just my own artificial way of separating the two things. That's really why I made them two lectures. It could easily have been one lecture.
Well, you lead right up to my second question, which was, there's a lot in what you do give us about the villages people come from, the family connections they had. But is that at any point really conceived of under the label Africa? Or is it really far more concrete than that? The specific place I'm from.
No, it's not Africa in a blanket kind of way. They come from a small, they describe their particular home. You cannot feel integrated within Africa. Africa is almost an abstraction. It's huge and impersonal. But the place they know is concrete. It's a home, it's a community, it has people in it, it has houses. They see the structure of the environment and the interpersonal connections, relationships, and so on. This is the reality. The Africa in the larger context is almost nebulous in those terms. Equano brings in Africa because I think he's trying to sell an idea which is hard for the Europeans to gather. His home in Iseke is actually not in large maps of Nigeria. You won't Iseke there. Achebe, who was the first person to locate it, had to go to the geological map. The geological map is the most detailed map of the country. They take a place because what they're doing is they're looking at the soil, the earth, looking for minerals. And they take every square inch of ground is actually explored in a geological survey. It's in that map that Achebe, using the linguistic and the demographic data that we find in Iguana's narrative, just pinpointed the place. Every one of us knew where his home was, using the evidence. But if you went to the map, the ordinary map of southeastern Nigeria, you won't find it. In fact, if you went looking for Iseke, the one that is written, you won't find it anywhere on earth because no such place exists. What he has done was to actually use phonetic formula to describe his home. Iseke, he had to use E as in English. You see that it's E-S-S-A-K-A. There's no place like that. But the E is I, actually, as in English. It's written as E, but it's said as E in English. That's where I, the SS, is following the English formula of if the S appears between two vowels, you double the S. That's what he did. But actually, Iseke is one S. In Igbo, if you use in Igbo orthography, it's one S. And then the same thing with A as in sen, ben. So it's I-S-E-K-E. In the map, it's actually Isieke. But when it's said Iseke, there's the addition of the I and E. So you have to actually transcribe this thing phonetically before you can get the actual name of his home. And once you do that, you can go straight and know where it is because there are other ways. The carving of the face, for instance, means that a large part of southeastern Nigeria is not included. He can't be in Owerri, but he's in Owerri dialect. But there's a part of Owerri dialect where the people have this, in Wirichi, they have their faces carved. And so that narrows it into quite a small part of Owerri, almost at the border between Owerri and Onitsha. So you drew that with a small circle. This Iseke must be in this place. And then you looked for the style of building. In Onitsha area, you used mud to build bricks for building. But in that area, you used sticks and wattle to tie these things, and then you plastered both sides with mud. But at the center, you have sticks and streams and things like that. So you knew from the description of the building style where that place could be. And then they use the face carving and that sort of thing. Using all that evidence, you can't miss where the place is. And once you go there, if you looked at a conventional map, a political map, you won't see Iseke because it's such a tiny place. And as for his name, Ekuano, Achebe had a house help, a young boy who was about 14 or 15, living with them, whose name was Ekuano, and he came from Osu, which is next door to Iseke. Ekuano is a popular name in that area. It's not a popular name in our area, for instance. So you could go by the name. It could only live in this area. And then you go there, and these are some other conditions that confirm your expectation. Ultimately, you know where precisely the man came from. There's no doubt about that. Yes.
Are you familiar with a book that came out recently about a black slave-owning family in Virginia? And this black slave master had himself been a slave and somehow managed to buy his freedom from his slave master. And his slave master became his mentor when he became a slave master.
No, this is read the book, but
we've heard of it.
yeah, I've heard about it. Yes, oh, no, there were in this country some former slaves who independent, free people, people who also were slaves. It's on record, yes, no doubt about that.
Let's take one more question, or maybe two.
Yes.
What I wanted to ask, what is interesting here in terms of the changing relationship between these narrators and their African history is that, of course, they're not historians, they're narrators, so they're writing these histories, biographies, autobiographies. Is that they really also constitute themselves as intellectuals, that kind of intellectual that come out. So there's obviously a certain degree of freedom that they feel, their capacity to write, because slaves couldn't write. So they are reconstituting themselves as certain intellectuals, because some of them became bishops, some of them became learned men. I was wondering, what are the conditions at the moment? For example, how do they author? What names do they use in their narratives? What do they call themselves? What the Euthymia kind of re-authors' names? So there are the different moments in their own lives where they're kind of diasporic, these intellectuals, because I was wondering the connection between the series of genre, this Achebi, and the novel, this slave narrative, with the post-colonial novel narrative.
Well, the genres, they're not historians. These are biographical fragments. It's like telling your own story. In fact, if you read them as history, they would confirm some aspects of history. But their main concern is not to tell you a historical kind of detailed narrative. Historians are trained to write, to handle facts in certain ways. These are not historians at all. These are using gut feeling. They're talking about their experience. And they, in fact, in some cases, like Equano's case, where he says, my home, in a very distant corner of the Benin Empire, is my home, the province of Igbo, and in that, among the Igbo, there's my town called Iseke. That's not actually accurate. The Benin Empire did not extend to Igbo area, but there are Igbo settlements that are very close there, and they actually absorbed elements, and they interacted with the Obas and the ruling class in the Benin Empire. There are myths and narratives interweave and interconnect, and so on. But Equano's place is far from the Benin Empire. It was never part of the Benin Empire. But the truth is that the Igbo knew about the Benin Empire. There is a form of narrative, an Igbo narrative, called the Idu. It's usually a story of oppression, where a captain, an Oba who becomes oppressive, is actually resisted by one of his generals. The general is Idu, and people call it the story of Idu and Oba, Akuko Idu and Oba, and then the short form of that narrative is the Idu narrative. And it's all about a wicked ruler who is resisted by a general. The general being the Idu, who opposes this, the Oba, and ultimately brings him down, and so on. People have that narrative, and they base it, and one of the form-like things in narrative is to distance it. In folk tales, you say, in the land of Oba and Idu, such and such a thing happens. Because in the formula of storytelling, you distance the story, you put it either in the past, very distant past, or you put it somewhere that is very far away, not in the immediate environment. I think that's a precautionary kind of thing, because if you libel somebody, and they can treat you very roughly. But if you put the story in the distant place, in the land of Oba and Idu, you can then libel they can't now claim that you're talking about them because you say, no. This is folk tale. I'm talking about what happened in the land of Oba and Idu. But a Guano who must have heard stories, children start hearing stories when they're quite young. At the age 11, you already are adopted into the narrative tradition. Many of us were. Actually, when I left Igboland, I was the age of a Guano, and I lived the rest of my life in northern Nigeria. But I've known all these, I've been formed within the culture itself. So he knew about Oba and Idu and all those things. And then trying to tell the Europeans who knew about Benin. The Benin Empire was very well known in the 18th century. He said, my home is part of what you know, the Benin Empire. But in fact, if you were a historian, we would say that this is misinformation because the Benin Empire did not extend to his home.
Thank you.
One final question.
With regards to the Benin Empire, just a very interesting point, just a comment. Actually, I would say that 18th century Europeans probably knew more about Africa than 20th century Europeans and Americans do. If you look at universal histories, for example, written at that time, they devoted many, many more pages, and the pages were in many respects more dispassionate and more accurate than what we see in universal histories written today, which is really a commentary on our times that our level of knowledge as a general level in the United States, for example, or in Western Europe, has actually declined with regards to Africa. And this is true even in the 18th century when there were obviously many people who had an interest in misrepresenting Africa, that it wasn't as misrepresented in many respects as it is today. This is a comment. I mean, you can say anything about it, but the fact that people would have known about Benin.
Oh, they did. They knew that from the Portuguese.
Yes.
But the ignorance was real. The quote from Jonathan Swift, which says that Mark Megas would put elephants where there should be towns, because they didn't know. And in fact, the Rugu story about mid-19th century was the time that Overbeck and Bach were trying. They came through Tripoli, and they were going through Borno and Sokoto and all those places. The hinterland was generally, I mean, when they talk about dark continents, there was some element of truth in that. They traded with the coast, they stayed in their ships, waited until the slaves were brought to them. Of course, they fed firearms into the place to ensure that the slaves were captured and so on. And the wars would take place and raise the slaves and so on. But knowledge of that area was rather vague, except that the Portuguese kept notes. They wrote about the Benin Empire. They had diplomatic relationship, so they knew about the coast quite well. And they even got deeper as you pass through the Congo, going down to Angola and so on. But in West Africa, it took time because, first of all, the malaria jungle was there. Say, for instance, in the Delta, there was a saying, beware the river long, where many went in and very few returned. It was called the white man's grave. And many of them didn't come out. So they stayed away until the mid-19th century.
Well, let us thank you, Emmanuel.